Can you just go back onto the first slide as well, please? Thank you. Yeah, got sneak preview. Great, so welcome and thank you all for joining us today for the book launch of Men and Welfare, which is a new edited collection with Routledge as part of their Research in Gender and Society series. We will be recording the presentation sections of the webinar, but again, we don't plan to share any of the discussion. We're going to have a series of short talks today, followed by some opportunity for Q&A. And as we just mentioned, this is actually really exciting because despite working together for the past 2 to 3 years on the collection, the authors and editors have yet to have these conversations collectively and in person. So for those of you that don't know me, my name is Anna Tarrant. I'm a professor of sociology at the University of Lincoln and the lead editor of the text. I'm also pleased to be joined by our co-editors and the research team for a study that I lead called Following Young Fathers Further, so Dr. Lindsay Ladlow and Laura Way. As mentioned, we're really delighted to be joined today by several of the contributors to the collection who'll be sharing their insights and discussing their chapters. Before we hand over to them, I just want to give some brief context to the collection, why we felt it was important to establish a more contemporary and cohesive account of the relationships between men, welfare and policy, and to really sort of think through and capture work and contributions that have really inspired us in this area of research. So Lindsay, if I could just ask you to move on the screen. Thank you. So why Men and Welfare? Well, as we outline in the introduction of the book, there are numerous reasons for its development. So the initial idea was initially driven in part by our own interests in engaged fatherhood and the applications of fatherhood research for policy and practice. So reflecting on my own sort of research expertise and research history, I've been involved in numerous research projects and studies in the past decade and some, including one that engaged critically with the male role model discourse in policy, another on men's experiences of kinship care, and then more recent work with young fathers and professionals, where we're co-producing practice relevant knowledge about young fatherhood and professional practice. So I've had this sort of long and sustained interest in the relationship between research, policy and practice, with a substantive and empirical focus on men and welfare, including the potential for transformative change and progress towards gender equality. The book was also inspired by the themes of men, gender divisions and welfare, as featured on the screen there. So that was published in 1998 and is one of the few texts to explicitly explore this question, alongside others at the time that were published by Keith Pringle and Fiona Williams. These texts were published in the mid-90s, and it was notable, I think, that few other texts have been developed since, despite continued international interest in this question since then. So our aim was to create this new cohesive, up-to-date account of the evolving and multifaceted relationships and relations between men, gender relations and welfare, and also to address observations that questions of men and welfare today remain somewhat of a shadowy feature of social policy, and a reference work of Shaver there. Finally, and I think a really important note or point to make right from the outset is that this text was very much developed with an emphasis on how supporting the welfare of men is also important for supporting and thinking through the well-being of women and children. An important question here, I think, is how do we create the conditions for all human flourishing, especially given the very thorny politics around these kinds of questions. And I think a focus on men's welfare and gendered relations in this regard is often very overlooked or perhaps not explicitly considered. So the text sought to really address that overlooked element of this question. Next slide, please, Lindsay. In terms of the book itself, the text is organised around 4 thematic sections. So the first section, Men, Gender Divisions, Welfare and Socio-Historic Change, deals with contemporary issues around work and care, including the impact of COVID-19 for policy and practice, which Sandy and Steve will be reflecting on. The second comprises a number of chapters exploring diversity in fathering, in a variety of international contexts. And one key feature of this collection is that it is international in its focus. And it does include attention to the experiences of refugees as well. And I'm really pleased that we'll hear from Esther Dermott and Tina Miller on this today. It also pays much greater attention to the life course and specifically the welfare of ageing and older men, which Brenda will be discussing in her presentation. Other noted innovations are that the text aims to move beyond this one-size-fits-all approach through considerations of complexity, diversity, intersectionality and contradiction. So Craig's chapter on young disabled men's experiences of alternative education provision explores some of those complexities. There's also, of course, always scope for more extended attention to a much wider set of issues than it's possible to deal with, I think, in an edited collection. And we do hope to see future attention to diverse range of areas, including migration, racialization, and the environment in future work on gender and welfare. So that's a very whistle-stop tour of the book and some of its key features. And without further ado, I'm now I'm pleased to invite some of our contributors to the collection to share their presentations. And we'll start with Jeff Hearn. So I'm absolutely delighted that you're here, Jeff. Thank you. We've just worked out, I think it was 2008 that we last saw each other in person. So it's been a while. But Jeff was incredibly helpful in developing some of the formative ideas for this book, provided some really useful advice and guidance on some of the developments in the field in its inception. So a huge thank you to you for that. He's, of course, an original author of the inspiring text for this book, so Men, Gender Divisions and Welfare, and kindly wrote a foreword and co-authored a chapter with Capano Rotelli. So, Jeff, over to you.
Okay, well, thanks so much, Anna. Yeah, it's really nice to see everybody. I can't see everybody, actually, because some people are hidden, but I can see at least the contributors, or most of the contributors. It's really nice. It's for the first time in many cases. And actually, some of the things you've said already, Anna, are some of the things that I was going to say. So I have to scrap that. But I thought what I'd say, well, this is rather impromptu, actually. I just checked on my email, and I found an email from you on the 28th of April, 3 years ago, actually. So it's almost like exactly 3 years, which is that's how long books of this kind take. And of course, as you said, also this book was partly inspired by the book, amazingly, 25 years ago. And I'll say a little bit about that in a minute. But before that, actually, I'm actually in Oxenhope in Yorkshire, and I've been sorting out a lot of papers here, interestingly. And I found actually an article which I wrote in 1980, that was called Men's Politics and Social Policy. And it was published in a sort of non-academic, in a social movement publication called the Bulletin on Social Policy. And it was about the relationship between, men's pro-feminist politics and this area of social policy, which at the time seemed a really weird combination to make. But now, actually, this is something that we're talking about, which is really good. I'm going to say a little bit about this previous book, and you've already mentioned Keith Pringle's book from 1995, I think, Men, Masculinities and Social Welfare, I think it's called, which was a really important book, but not actually that well known, perhaps I would say, at least not so well known internationally. It's known in the UK, perhaps more than elsewhere in the world. But I just said a little bit about this previous book. It's a long story, but I'll try and keep it down to a few minutes. That originally, the three of us, the three editors, Jenny Poppe, Jeanette Edwards, and myself, we wanted to call the book The Trouble with Men, actually. That was the title we pushed to the publisher. They didn't like that. They wanted these kind of key words in the title, gender divisions and welfare. The words would be picked up by librarians, you understand, and would market it. But the book was actually inspired by the idea of looking at the trouble with men. And it's an ambiguous issue in the sense that we were concerned, as you already said, Anna, with issues around men and welfare, both in terms of, if you like, the problems that men create in welfare terms for, well, other people, women and children, and myself, so now non-binary and trans, but also for themselves. So it's the problems men create and the problems men experience. It's this sort of double-sided problematic. that's what we were trying to get at. So that's what the first book, so to speak, was about. But it arose actually from a rather complicated story where there was a previous ESRC, the Research Council. I think they called it even a small program. It had 7 projects in it, actually. And the program, or small program, was called the Management of Social Welfare, which is also an ambiguous title, interestingly, because the management of social welfare could mean the sort of corporate or governance or national sort of management, you know, from on high in terms of, say, financial planning. But it could also mean this issue of how people manage their lives, and how people survive or not survive, sort of managing problems. And I mean, that has a whole story behind it, which goes back to 1985, actually, where the ESRC commissioned consultancy report on what was going on in the 80s, late 80s, around social policy and social welfare. First with the Conservatives, Conservative government that was in quite a mess at the time, those who remember. And I think what happened was this program was funded as a kind of compromise, both from the sort of right wing, in terms of looking at fairly individualistic approaches to social welfare, and away from the sort of welfare dependency on the right, and then from the left, critique of looking at what you might call difference and intersectionality in a more sort of complex way, and away from what you might say looking at gender categories or racialization categories as sort of fixed blocks. So anyway, this research program, I think it was launched in 1989, it was funded from 1990, there were 7 projects, and it went on for about four years. But in those 7 projects, and I was involved in the ones around violence, the theme of gender was absolutely central, actually, in all the projects. And that's what led to 2 books, including the one that you've been talking about. So there's a kind of whole story behind this, how gender, in a sense, was not actually highlighted in the initial thinking behind the ESRC program, but actually came out very strongly from the actual 7 projects, because you couldn't really discuss how people manage their lives or how people survive or not survive if you're studying violence without looking at gender, as one example. So that was what that book was about. And I think it's an interesting book to look at if people haven't seen it from 25 years ago. One of the chapters was actually called The Welfare of Men ? Because as soon as one talks about welfare, it's, as again to repeat, it's not only about the welfare of men, but also the impact of welfare on others and other men as well. Okay, I think that's the main thing I wanted to say. Meanwhile, of course, perhaps to just add a bit of context to it, the whole area of studying men and masculinities in all sorts of, many different ways, both sort of individually and in organizations, in communities, and globally, was sort of growing and developing, I guess, from the sort of 70s and in the 80s and in the 90s. And just as an interesting comment, Keith Pringle's book, Men, Masculinities and Welfare, was published in the same year, I think, as Raymond Connell's book called Masculinities, which of course has been extremely influential and probably much more well known than the book on welfare that we've talked about. So there was a sort of a confluence of these ideas going on. I think that's probably what the main thing I want to say. I was going to repeat these 4. I should say that in the foreword, Jenny Poppy, who actually was the lead author on the old book, I'll call it, she and I did a kind of little summary of some of the things I've been talking about, and we actually emphasised 4 points, which I think you more or less paraphrased or repeated. Which I think, one basic one I think is that the previous book was very British, whatever that means. It was very methodological nationalist, as I would call it now, whereas this book is very international in several senses, and you already said, not just in terms of countries, but also issues of migration and refugees and so on. And also, it's a lot more concerned with some of the contradictions and some of the complications, and I guess what is now called intersectionality. Although I would argue intersectionality was actually it was there in the previous work in the 80s and 90s actually, but perhaps wasn't sort of named so much so explicitly then. I mean, issues of racialization were definitely there, but I think they've become more highlighted. I think that's the other thing. And then perhaps the last thing I'd say, and then I'll shut up, is this issue of life course. And actually, I mean, in other work, I've criticized the idea of life course with Wendy Parkin, actually, because I think it's got some limitations. But I do think looking at age and aging and ageism, or double ageism to both young and old, and issues of so-called generation is very, very important. And, you know, it's still actually quite easy to be ageist. People are ageist much more readily than they are sometimes sexist or even racist. It's much more legitimate to be ageist. And I think, you know, bringing age into the picture in this book, in the new book, I mean, is extremely important, not only for older people, but people of all ages, basically. Okay, that's my, probably more than 5 minutes, probably 6.5, so I'm sorry about that. Okay.
Thank you, Jeff. That's really interesting to hear the history of the book. So thank you for that. We'll take questions at the end. So I'd just like to introduce the next speakers. So we've got Dr. Sandy Ruxton, an independent researcher, and Dr. Stephen Burrell from the University of Durham.
Okay, thanks very much. It was great to hear your background talk there, Jeff. I think I got critiqued in that book, actually. So here we are 25 years later. It's not exactly a right to reply, but it's nice to be in this book anyway. But our chapter, Men, Work and Care in the Wake of COVID-19 in the UK, we explored the gender changes in work and care that have been going on, accelerated by COVID-19, and how the relationship between the two impacted on men's and women's welfare. I was sort of thinking about this before, you know, if I was writing this chapter now, there's so many other contextual issues that seem to have come along. So, you know, cost of living crisis, falling living standards, war in Ukraine, rising energy and food prices, Brexit, departure of much migrant labour. You know, all these issues are around us now, which weren't so much there before, although we do have some of the overhang of COVID. So economic inactivity and high rates of illness post-COVID as well. So, you know, the context has shifted, and it feels like, you know, people have slightly forgotten about COVID, even though it's still obviously with us. But moving back to our chapter, you know, it's obvious that work has been for a long time a key component of male identity, and I think Jeff and David Morgan and people like this have written about this in the past. Before COVID, obviously, this was the case. You know, we faced since then a sort of long-term shift away from Fordist production mode, away from manual jobs, away from heavy industry towards automation, the rise of the service sector, casualisation, and that's had impacts on families and on men within families as well. So in a sense, it's been a threat to men's breadwinner identity, but also perhaps an opportunity to reappraise and reassess where men are at in relation to families and children. Now, COVID-19 obviously threw issues of care and men's relationships with care into sharp relief. We saw the centrality of care to individual and community well-being that was starkly visible. So community support, mutual aid, the importance of, albeit female-dominated, low-paid care sector, but also other perhaps less visible contributions, essential work, much of it by men. Bus and delivery drivers, utility workers, security guards. Many of those groups are predominantly men, and actually the highest death rates were amongst the security guards, I think that's right to say, and certainly in the UK. So what happened to the labour markets during COVID-19 in the UK? Initially, male-dominated sectors, it had been thought that they would be less effective, but they were more effective than the initial modelling suggested. And that was a similar pattern to the 2008 global financial crisis, although, you know, austerity then impacted more as time went on women. During COVID, women dominated the hardest hit sectors, so retail, hospitality, but they also make up 70% of health and education workers, where employment actually rose during that period. As we know, women are twice as likely to work in the public sector than men. Men are twice as likely to be self-employed. And self-employment was actually a sector that was hard hit during the pandemic. We know too that women's employment is often part-time, especially after birth of a child, and over-concentrated, as I've said, in low-wage jobs with less security. And again, part-timers were more severely affected by the pandemic. Overlaid or mixed in with this, of course, there are some of the sort of gender, class, racial inequalities that Jeff and Anna have mentioned. So for middle-class people, they were able to combine, generally speaking, home and office work more easily. They had more control over their hours, even if work intensified. And also, you know, women tended to take more responsibility for some of the schooling at home. Working class people, especially women, young people, people of colour, they were in frontline jobs with little flexibility, precarious contracts, minimal control. So I'm going to just bung the baton over to Stephen now as quickly as I can, because I'm sure I've just got over my time, and we'll try and make sure everybody else has a go.
Yeah, so I suppose, like we argue in the chapter, really, you know, that the pandemic kind of really highlighted and demonstrated how influential like gender norms, expectations continue to be in the UK, really, you know, with, especially if we look at care work, for example, you know, we did see women, you know, undertaking the bulk of the like increased care work, which occurred during the pandemic. Like, so in the first 4 weeks of lockdown, 2/3 more childcare was being undertaken by women than men, and of course that potentially compounded like existing gender inequalities in society. But I suppose there were also, I suppose, the shaking up of society by the pandemic did present opportunities for change as well, right? And we did see many men's involvement in caregiving increase in things like fatherhood, and that has continued in some cases. Like recent ONS data in the UK suggests that, you know, the number of stay-at-home dads has increased by 1/3, for example. Yeah, and I suppose maybe it's also motivated some organizations, employers to take caregiving more seriously. Like we are seeing more pushes for change, perhaps. Like, and obviously the government has started to invest more in childcare and boosting free childcare and things like that. There's also been big support among the public for like increases in public sector pay, like, you know, big support for the recent public sector strikes, for example. Yeah, but at the same time, I guess government responses have, you know, arguably not really matched up to the scale of the challenge when it comes to things like childcare, social care so far, and we are potentially seeing the return of like austerity as well, right? So, and I guess also there's been a lack of attention at the policy level still from the role of gender norms in all of this. And the need for kind of gender transformative efforts to, you know, encourage men's involvement in things like parental leave. So yeah, I guess we argue that, just to briefly wrap up, we argue that kind of policy responses to COVID, I suppose, often ignored the kind of gender dynamics of that crisis. And yeah, as Sandy said, I guess we've often been in a rush to maybe forget about COVID, which is understandable in some ways, you know, given how traumatic it's been. But perhaps we do need to remember, you know, not just to help us grieve and process what happened, but to keep in mind all the lessons it has taught us, I suppose, about the importance of care and interdependence, and how we're all reliant on that. How we're all reliant on other people, and certainly men included. And perhaps that's something men find particularly difficult, but which some men have found quite a transformative experience as well as a result of the pandemic. So yeah, better stop there, but thank you so much.
Brilliant. Thank you both so much. So next up, we have Dr. Ariane Critchley from the University of Stirling.
Thanks, Lindsay. Yeah, some really interesting contributions so far. So I'd like to start the brief summary of my own chapter with a quote, not from that chapter, but from the one by Esther Dermot and Tina Miller, chapter 7, that they'll be discussing next, which I really love their chapter, which focuses on being a father and a refugee. And that's not only because I want to acknowledge how the ideas and work of other authors in this collection have shaped my own thinking over time, or to demonstrate what a coherent and important contribution to the conversation this book represents. I do think it does. I think it's a really lovely collection. But because I hope the quote provides a kind of helpful way into understand the relationship between men, welfare, and applied disciplines, including my own discipline of social work. So Dermot and Miller write on page 98 of the book, welfare is not just a system of principles and policies, but is interpreted by intermediaries such as teachers and social workers, implemented and interpreted by informal institutional actors, such as charity sector volunteers and religious organisations, and experienced in very personal and sometimes confounding ways. So I really like that idea, and my chapter seeks to engage with how social workers and other professionals working in child welfare and protection settings particularly interpret welfare in relation to men as fathers, or perhaps more accurately, choose not to interpret it. I argue that social workers have power and influence over family life in ways that matter, which speak to Hearn's concern in the original 1988 collection with how men's violence is produced and reproduced. And I end the chapter by suggesting that social work activities are both confounded by, but also reproducing of, the structural problem of men's violence in families. So I became interested in these issues as a result of a study of pre-birth child protection, which I undertook. And this wasn't a study of fatherhood as such, but of the kind of interface of practice between social workers and families more broadly in that pre-birth period. So I think the perinatal period is a period of intense vulnerability for families and for individuals within families. So this week, the UK press has been reporting on the enduring problem of racism within maternity care and the dangerous impact that this has on women and on children, and therefore, of course, on fathers too. So for fathers, I think pregnancy is a time when they might legally, socially, and emotionally be written into or written out of their children's lives. And this is an issue that's also touched on by Elizabeth Keeley and Robert Bolton in their really thoughtful chapter on non-married fatherhood in Ireland in the collection. Chapter 9. So my own chapter in this book can be in many ways be read as a companion piece side by side with an article that I currently have under review, where I consider the legal vulnerability of men as fathers as a result of increased child protection involvement with families during pregnancy before infants have arrived. And through my study of pre-birth child protection, I became very struck by how fathers were characterized, and to some extent how they presented in child protection meetings and encounters. And this stood in such stark contrast to the way that fathers presented in research encounters, and their tenderness for their babies, for their partners, that their feelings about their families were really evident. But in child protection meetings and settings, there seemed to be no place for this. And their men were encountered primarily as risky. So the risk seemed to ooze out of the men in really uncontained ways. And so a man who is a risk due to a particular kind of behavior became a risk to everyone at all times in all ways. So I give an example of that from the data in the chapter. And I became quite obsessed by how easily the fathers in child protection settings became characterized as wholly risky. The kind of lack of space for them to be simultaneously risky and loving, or risky and caring, or risky and vulnerable, with a range of welfare needs. So in this chapter, I explore those ideas through reference to the most recent Bond film, and the way that Bond in that narrative is very much redeemed by his fatherhood, and this very strong cultural trope of fatherhood is somehow redeeming. And the character is able to access both tough and gentle aspects of masculine identities. And I feel that men in child protection encounters are really denied that possibility, and I find that very troubling. So in the chapter, I begin to unpick why that might be, focusing on the atmosphere of suspicion, fear, and skepticism that pervades child welfare and protection responses to men as fathers. So I suppose I would contend that men's welfare isn't a concern of child protection agencies generally. We're not held accountable for it in the same way as we are for the welfare of children and, to a certain extent, women. And I sort of wanted to problematize that position, drawing on the work of others, including the, Following Young Fathers and Following Young Fathers Further team, Anna's work, and that of Georgia Phillip, and this kind of long history of struggle in social work with this problem of working with men as fathers. So really the chapter is a culmination of almost a decade of wondering what might happen if men were centralised in social work encounters around child welfare and protection, and if it could be a priority, not in an instrumental way in order to achieve the welfare of children, but for its own sake.
Thanks, Ariane. It's a really interesting chapter. Thank you. So next up, we've got Professor Esther Dermer from the University of Bristol and Professor Tina Miller from Oxford Brookes. And I've got a slide to share. So let me just do that.
Thank you, Lindsay. So there's not very much content on the slide. It was just a bit of variation for what you get to look at rather than just seeing faces for a change. So I think I'm going to do the 5-minute talking bit, but if people have got other comments and questions later, then Tina's going to fill in or kind of respond to some of those bits. It's very difficult, as anyone who knows me, for me to keep down to 5 minutes as it is. So for the two of us to do that would probably not quite work. Okay, so thank you very much for the invitation to be part of the edited collection and to talk about our chapter at this launch today. It is really nice to hear and see all the other people from the collection that we just seen as names, and we didn't get a chance to get together in any other way. And as I've said, Tina's already, Tina's also on this call. I can see her, maybe some of you can't. This chapter is based on interview data and also some reviews of policy documents, part of a British Academy grant that was looking at the everyday experience of Syrian father refugees in both England and in Sweden. So there was a comparative element to it, although we focus in this chapter mainly on data from England. And we were looking at how care practices are enabled or inhibited through support from different welfare actors, framed kind of quite broadly. So when the call for this edited collection came up, we were just in the kind of the beginning analysis stage, and it really seemed that there were themes from the ideas for this edited collection, and also particularly with the precursor to this issue, the book that really talked about men, gender, divisions and welfare from over 20 years ago, that really chimed with some of our thinking. So in that, as you've already heard, men were viewed as, or talked about as being, troublesome, troubling for welfare services and social policies in different ways. And our suggestion is that Syrian refugee fathers are a new example of continuity with that perspective, so that the political context might be new. Some of the social problems, excuse me, that have emerged might be slightly different, but engaging with men as fathers seem to us to remain somewhat problematic and fractured. And I've tried to kind of simplify this down to kind of two points for this discussion. So we argue that migrant, and perhaps particularly it is, especially it is refugee fathers, provide some difficulties for formulations of welfare and masculinities in two ways. So firstly, and other migrant scholars have talked about this as well, their value in the lives of children is downplayed as either relatively unimportant compared to mothers, or in fact, and this chimes with what Arianna's saying as well, a particular risk to their families and wider society. And secondly, they are viewed as failing to fit with dominant cultural values of fatherhood that emphasize intimacy and emotional reciprocity at the expense of perhaps more breadwinning identities. So I'm going to want to say just a little bit more about each of those two. So firstly, the framing of vulnerability that we see in discourses around resettlement for refugee fathers, or refugees in general, tends to focus on the needs of women and children. So in UK policy documents on resettlement, for example, the focus on vulnerability is made in ways that are either tacitly or sometimes really explicitly position men as perhaps irrelevant for positive aspects of family life. So they're certainly framed as being less important for children's well-being than mothers are. So therefore, kind of relocation of fathers with their families is not viewed as so important as having mothers co-located with children. But also what was interesting to highlight was they were viewed as being a potential threat to their families. Not perhaps, and maybe it's worth saying something about the idea of threat or risk in that context. So not quite in the way that we might be thinking about in kind of social work kind of senses, but certainly a threat in terms of failing to align or to adapt to norms about gender equality, education, and parenting practices. that there's an assumption in some of the documents, the local level documents that were produced, for example, suggest that the children might need to be protected from their parents because of, in relation to corporal punishment, or that these Syrian refugee fathers may not support boys and girls kind of equally, because they will kind of fall into kind of gendered stereotypes about what is acceptable, and also that for their wives that needed to be supported as well. So refugee fathers are frequently depicted as troublesome. They're positioned as a problem or a risk, and that means that their own needs are left largely invisible. That's the first thing we highlighted. And secondly, that the welfare systems didn't do a very good job of supporting men in fulfilling their own ideas of what successful masculinity and fatherhood should look like, which centered very much around being a financial provider and being a head of household. So there's something interesting going on in that these men were often enacting ideas of contemporary involved fatherhood. They were doing a lot of the care work associated with their children. That might mean taking children to and from school, lots of the management of childcare, so coordinating a lot of health appointments, for example, working out paperwork that was required, those kind of activities. So they were definitely involved in the minutiae of everyday caring practices while struggling to find employment. However, these activities weren't in line with their own preferences and priorities. And therefore, what we suggest is that these refugee fathers are troubling perhaps for states and welfares, but also for how many of us as fatherhood researchers and researchers around masculinity, how we, the literatures and the current kind of ideas, which often in terms of contemporary fatherhood literature does call for a recognition of significance of diversity in fathering masculinities, but also has a tendency to adhere to a dominant Western formulation of a particular progressive, inverted commas, version of fathering. So those were our two main arguments in the paper. And I'd just like to say, I think that the concepts raised by the initial book 25 years ago, where we're at now, were really useful to work with and helped us think through some of our findings. Thank you.
Thanks, Esther. So next we've got Craig Johnston, and I've also got some slides to share from Craig.
Is it working, Lindsay?
Yeah, sorry, let me just get this.
Yeah. I was at a conference about 2 weeks ago and I tried Zoom and it was just messed up. So I thought if somebody else has got control, that we're not holding up anything. Oh, great stuff. Thank you. I'll try and run through the slides quickly. But first of all, just thank you for asking me. As you say, I think it was a couple of years ago we had a discussion, and I was fortunate enough to be joined by Simon Bradford, who is now retired, but was involved in youth related issues in education for many years at Brunel University. And I've written a couple of articles. So this article is very much about masculinity, disability, social class, intersections of, and also sort of compounding disadvantages in a particular setting, which is alternative provision. And really alternative provision is something that has been understudied. I've been studying for about 20 years and nobody else seemed to pay attention to what was going on there, but it become quite very popular in English policy discourse. Could you move on to the next slide, please, Lindsay? Great. So essentially, APs are education settings created to provide short-term support for school-age young people. I'm going to talk about those young people and who those young people are. Around 4% of students are now educated in alternative settings, which has grown because of school exclusions. And roughly there's about 46 young people permanently excluded a day in England. And again, I'll discuss who they are. So it's a question of profits of space, because alternative provisions are segregated provisions. And these segregated provisions cater mostly for 14 to 16-year-olds. So they're set out as short-term provisions, but actually 80% of the students in alternative provisions never return to regular education or mainstream education. Although we do know that primary school children are also educated there too. So it's about the profit of space. It's about the profit of segregated spaces. And capital seem to be a natural one to sort of bring in here. So in terms of the value of human capital, social capital, cultural capital, etc. So what's happening in these provisions and who's accessing them? So just to give you a little insight into who's accessing these provisions predominantly, 14 to 16-year-olds are mentioned. 76% of all students in alternative provisions are young men. 94% have a disability or diagnosed with a disability, are also on free school meals. So mostly predominantly poor, young, disabled men who are getting educated in these particular provisions. Do you mind moving on, please, Lindsay? So how are they ending up here? Well, we know for the last 25 years, the regimes of managerialism, economic individualism has sort of created an environment in school that are making visible particular young people, and particularly young people without certain forms of capitals, or those capitals are seen in deficit. So in terms of the focus on welfare, it depends on what counts as legitimate need, what is needed, who needs what. So in a very much post-welfare society, education has become less of a welfare state, more about propping up the global market. And as Thompson mentioned, young disabled men have been long positioned over the last 10, 15 years as principally ignorant yobs who can't be taught, or at least have to be educated in a different way from the mainstream society. So, Lindsay, do you mind moving on? So essentially, somebody asked me one day, why is this the case? Well, as Michelangelo said, how do we create a perfect education system? Well, we get rid of the people who don't fit into that system. And of course, they end up in particular provisions. So you basically just take a slab of marble and cut off the superfluous bits. And those superfluous bits are predominantly young men with disabilities from poor backgrounds. Do you mind moving on, Lindsay? So how is this system being created? Who have been created? So working class modes of distinction and abilities in the labour market have been highlighted as problematic for a long time for men, but also the knowledge and skills invested in working class disabled bodies as slow to learn, problematic to learn, and also bad employees generally who can often be ignorant or positioned as ignorant, or positioned in certain characteristics that are deficit and failure. And these characteristics are used to strip power away from these young people. So essentially what's happening in education and also in the employment market, which is service dominated now, is the deficit and failure characteristics that are attached to these particular groups of young men. So Lindsay, do you mind moving on? So if we are to create an intersectionality or compounded disadvantage, how do we explain this? Well, the explanation is quite simply the sense of embodiment attached to these young people are seen as something as negative performances of disabilities, of psychic properties that intertwine with negative views of both disability, working classness, and also positioning young men as predominantly underdeveloped or deficient bodies. Do you mind moving on, Lindsay? I'm trying to get through quick as possible. So we see in education, we've got young disabled men predominantly positioned in segregated provisions with lack of resources or lack of capitals, or the capitals that are attached to them are wrong, a lack of facilities and funding. And we know that in APs, for example, that you're 3 times more likely to have staff who do not have teaching qualification, for example. There isn't the appropriate facilities to do normal GCSEs, such as sport or science, which again doubly disadvantages young people. They're located in closed environments away from the networks that constitute regular forms of social discourse that nurture valued and valuable capitals, such as we see constantly in the educational market. So can you move on, Lindsay? I think it's coming up to the sort of last slide. So to sum up, basically, the advantages accrued and by accessing use of forms of capitals secure a preemptive rights over the future, which has been well established. So these acknowledge the capitals are unevenly distributed in relation to young people in AP, and these young people are predominantly young men. Policymakers are currently and overwhelmingly painting a positive picture of segregated provisions, and most of the literature that tends to exist in this talks about how valuable the capitals are there for these young men. However, we know that only 1% of those students go on to achieve 5 GCSEs. So the prevailing fallacy is consistently through success as individual progress stories, but of course they are not acting as a safety net in relation to Purduevian analysis of capital. So that's my final one. I do apologise if I've run over. Happy to follow anybody on Twitter, and if you'd like to get in contact with me, there we go. But thank you for asking me to be part of the book. It was great read, and it's now folded over and marked out in lots of pen marks throughout.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Craig. So next up, we have Dr. Brenda Hyanger from King's College London.
Sorry, I had to find the mute button. Okay, right. So I'm really glad to hear about everyone's contribution and reading the book. As Craig has indicated, mine's got pen marks all over the place. So it was a really, really great collection. So today I want to be giving an overview of our chapter. It's chapter 18. Chapter 18, this was co-authored by Dr. Dylan Neal and Professor Anne Phoenix, who are both based at the Social Research Institute at UCL. The chapter itself examines the social participation and social support practices of older men from minoritized ethnic groups who are living in the UK. So just a bit of context, we know that both social isolation and loneliness impact our health, our well-being, and our quality of life. And older people are at increased risk if we consider the physical, the social, and the psychological changes that come with the aging process. But we also know that older people are not this homogeneous group, and studies have shown that older men are at risk when we compare them to older women. And the book actually documents the ways in which these masculinities can hinder support seeking, which can then place men in these positions of vulnerability when it comes to social isolation and loneliness. This also goes for older men from minoritized ethnic groups, but if we take like an intersectional lens, we need to consider how the intersection of age-related processes with migration-related processes and racism and discrimination and the multiple forms of disadvantage faced by older men from minoritized ethnic groups, especially if we take like this life course approach, and how this can then place them at risk of isolation and loneliness in later life. The good news is that there are plenty of initiatives that address isolation and loneliness, especially for older people. And some of them in particular, like Men in Sheds, are targeted at older men. But just given the life course perspective, we are unsure as to whether these particular initiatives are going to be suitable for older men from minoritized ethnic groups. So this is the starting point of our particular chapter. We wanted to use our data to examine older minoritized men's social participation and support practices, and to try and identify how they want to be perceived as older people, and to explore how their social participation and support practices reduce vulnerability to social isolation and loneliness. And then finally, to try and use the findings to suggest how welfare initiatives for isolation and loneliness can meet their needs. Our data was, we analyzed data collected as part of this exploratory study that was looking at social networks of older people from minoritized ethnic groups. We conducted secondary qualitative data analysis, and using dialogic performance narrative analysis, we identified these 3 key themes, which we obviously go into detail within the chapter. But just as an overview of the themes, first of all, we found that community groups of shared culture were protective of social isolation and loneliness. The men that we looked at their narratives gave these accounts of groups that they often attended where they could socially interact and receive emotional support. And these were of groups of other men as well, with a shared language, shared culture. And this particular finding counters these narratives, dominant narratives that older men are these stoic people who may not express their emotions. Instead, what we found that these particular groups offered these avenues for them to express their concerns, thereby reducing the risk of isolation and loneliness. And now within the literature of loneliness in later life, it suggests that men often rely on their partners for social interactions, and this then protects them from isolation and loneliness. But our findings actually highlight the role of other members of the family, in particular siblings, who offer not only financial support or informational support, but also instrumental support. And then they also offer this sense of belonging and companionship. Lastly, we found that the narratives counter these dominant narratives of older people as passive and dependent. The men actually positioned themselves as being independent and active contributors to society. So there were narratives where some of them were like activists fighting for, the users of the rights of bus users. Others had informal roles like in residential associations, and they helped around the neighborhood and helped other people who were not as able as they were. So within the chapter, we argue that these findings can help to inform welfare initiatives for loneliness. One, they do highlight the importance of these social support groups of shared characteristics, be they in terms of like shared age or shared language or ethnic background, and they are protective of loneliness. So where possible, these groups should really be supported. The findings also illuminate this distinct role that siblings play in reducing isolation and loneliness, and the way in which some family events can be patterned throughout the year, giving them things to look forward to. But we definitely need further studies to understand their unique role in later life, given the shared history and their upbringings. And we do know that this resonates with other studies which have found like friendship relationships and peer relationships are quite important when it comes to later life. And then lastly, we found that older men can be active and are actually active in their communities in later life. And these minoritized ethnic groups, people, if we could provide opportunities to support them to participate, then these opportunities should be made available. For those who are already active, efforts should be made to continue supporting them for as long as possible. So one of the things that I noted with our chapter in reading the other chapters in part 4 of the book was this issue of questioning or highlighting the complexities, as Jeff, you're indicating, the contextual issues and the contradictions. They were also picked up within the other chapters, challenging these dominant narratives that we have, and also highlighting the role of the wider policy issues and how that then impacts on individual behaviors, then to, in my case, in the study that we're looking at, to impact, to increase risk of social isolation and loneliness. In the interest of time, I'm going to stop there, and I'll hand back to the group.
Great, thank you so much. Honestly, this has been incredibly fascinating, and it's lovely to hear each of you reflect on what is clearly a really thriving area of research, with huge potential for much more in the future. I think what's been especially striking for me is just how much policy reinforces and practice reinforces really these deficit framings of men, framings of them as risk, and also as kind of potentially a threat to their families. And I think that's something that I have been kind of keen to think differently about, in a way that we address violence and we address some of the challenges that men might present in different contexts, but also in a way that's about care and compassion. And I think there's a strong need for a different kind of policy and social policy making to really address those issues head on, I think, and in a different way. And I think that's going to be a life's work potentially. We've only got 5 minutes left, but did anybody have any questions or broader comments based on the presentations that they'd like to raise before we conclude the session? Any observations? Yeah, Jeff.
I mean, if anybody else wants to speak, I won't, but if nobody else, I mean, I wanted to, one thing I was going to say about the old book and the program that preceded it over 4 or 5 years, one of the themes that was actually put forward by the ESRC as the sort of driving theme was around this model of stress, coping and social support, which is basically a sort of social psychological model, particularly used in the US. And, just listening to the last presentation from Brenda and colleagues, I think, and it's a very mixed picture, because, I mean, in one sense, support is obviously useful for people to cope and manage their lives. I mean, and everyone, we all need it. But I mean, I think support needs to be broken down or, analyzed much more. I mean, what kind of support we're talking about? I mean, particularly when you're dealing with issues or some issues to do with men, and violence is perhaps the most obvious one. I mean, support can be very counterproductive if it's supporting in the wrong way. So I think it's a very obvious way of looking at things, and it appeals to policymakers because it kind of individualizes to some extent, or makes the people responsible for the support they get. But it needs to be much more sort of explored and looked at, what kind of support. Is it progressive support? Is it feminist support? Is it anti-racist support, anti-age, and so on and so forth? So it's a kind of, you can't disagree with support, but what follows next, I think, is the really key question.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And again, I think there's a more unpacking to be had around the different languages that we use as well. So, when we're talking about support, again, is it formal, informal, and how does that sit against particular infrastructures that either support or work against those different systems? So, yeah, I think that's a really interesting question that could be taken forward, actually. And one thing that I think probably wasn't an absence from some of the chapters was around men who provide support and care as well in professional contexts. So there's some really great work by an old colleague of ours, Sandy Martin Robb, around men who deliver care-based support in different contexts. And again, I think that's a really important question that could be thought about much more with regards to how we actually bring men into context of support, however we define those. And that's definitely an area that I'd like to see more research on. Yeah. Any other kind of comments before we conclude from anyone? Sandy?
Well, I feel terrible about this, but I'm going to make an advert just to end with, which is that Stephen and I run a podcast that some of you might know called Now and Then. And given the sort of richness of the contributions that we've heard about today, I just think it would be, good to offer you the opportunity to get in touch with us and perhaps come on the podcast if you're interested. So do get in touch with us afterwards, because it would be nice to have some of this work disseminated more widely.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you so much. Would you like to pop your contact details in the chat, Sandy? That'd be great. And it's a really wonderful podcast. I can't recommend it highly enough. So yeah, thank you for your important work with that. I'm sorry we don't have more time. I feel like we probably could have had an hour and a half for this session, but it's been really wonderful, as I say, to bring everyone together into one room, to really celebrate the bringing together of the collection. I'm really pleased that you've all enjoyed working with us on the collection, and that you found it so rich and useful for your own work, and I hope it continues to be into the future. I suppose just to say, really, I'd love to stay in touch with you all. If there's any kind of future work that comes from this, or if there's any opportunity to plug the book, please absolutely do. I've done a bit of tweeting today from this session as well, and I hope we can continue these conversations into the future. I think they're really important, and again, the book, I think, is just the start of a conversation as opposed to the end. So thank you so much for your time, and yeah, I'm sure we'll be in touch and see each other in future, and please do go on the podcast if you can. Thank you so much.
Where would this recording be, Anna? Where would it be?
Oh yes, good point. So we'll pop that on our Following Young Fathers Further website, which is under reconstruction at the moment, and we're hoping to promote in the next couple of weeks. But we'll also pop it on Twitter as well, and we'll email you the links to the recordings. And again, if you can share and promote those, that would be fantastic. And I'm sure that might lead to further conversations beyond this call as well. So yeah. Okay. Wonderful. Thank you very much, everyone. It's lovely to see you all. And perhaps one day we'll be in person as well. Brilliant. Thank you so much. Thank you.